Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
From politics and war to mobile games, former US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld is taking on a new and somewhat unexpected endeavor: video game development. Over the past few years, Mr. Rumsfeld has been working on a mobile app to bring a card game from World War II into the digital age.
Help me God.
Donald Rumsfeld was the youngest defense secretary in US history. Then, when sworn in again 25 years later, he became the oldest. Under George Bush's presidency, he led America to war, first in Afghanistan and then in Iraq in 2003. He later named his book after his most famous saying at a press conference during his justification of the invasion.
That there are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we now know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we do not know we don't know.
As well as his war strategy, Rumsfeld became highly controversial for his handling of the Abu Ghraib torture and prisoner abuse scandal. He later admitted he should have stepped down then. Known for his outspokenness and candor, he gradually lost political support as the wars continued, and he resigned in 2006. For years after, Rumsfeld kept a low profile in New Mexico.
We shall never surrender.
But now he's turned his hand to technology, developing this gaming app, Churchill Solitaire. It's no trivia game on things known and unknown, nor is it a game of war. Instead, it's based on Winston Churchill's version of the card game, using 2 decks instead of the traditional 1 and 10 columns instead of 7. Well, we're joined now live by Donald Rumsfeld. Mr. Rumsfeld, there's one known, and that is that you've got this app. Why? Why have you done it?
Well, I was taught this game by a Belgian diplomat who was in London when the Belgian government was there in exile when the Nazis occupied Belgium. And he learned it from Winston Churchill, and when I was U.S. ambassador to NATO, he taught it to me. And it's a fascinating game. It requires strategy. It requires thinking 4 or 5 moves ahead. And I've always found it very interesting, and I was afraid it would be lost to the ages with Sir Winston Churchill gone and the Belgian diplomat gone. I don't know how many people know the game other than me, and I decided that it should be available to the world.
By implication, you have effectively learnt the game from Churchill himself, because your conduit played with him and then played with you. So would you have beaten Churchill?
Oh, my goodness. He was such an impressive thinker and strategist. You know, like any public leader, there were bumps in the road along the way, as we all know, but certainly he was the leading statesman of that century, and I wouldn't even think of competing with Sir Winston Churchill.
Well, I mean, of course, Churchill left a degree of world order from a terribly disordered Second World War. One could argue that perhaps your war, well, you left a lot of disorder. Do you now have a sense of regret about that element of your life, which you're perhaps making up for in a more accessible way?
Well, of course, everyone wishes things were perfect. But the attack on the United States in September 11th of 2001 was a serious one, and the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda operating out of Afghanistan needed to be stopped before they imposed even greater carnage on the world. Today, what we're seeing is a struggle within the Muslim faith among Islamists and the vast majority of the Muslims who are peace-loving, and a strife between the Sunnis and the Shia. We saw the Arab Spring that turned into an Arab summer and an Arab winter, and it's been going on. It is a very difficult, dangerous, and untidy world with a lot of people funding terrorism, people recruiting for terrorism, and it's a difficult time in the world, to be sure.
But do you not track what is happening now, particularly in Iraq and around Iraq and Syria, do you not track some of that back to your own decision to get involved in bombing Iraq, which after all had nothing whatever to do with 9/11?
Well, first of all, the President of the United States is the one that made the decision, and he went to the Congress, and the Congress was supportive, and he went to the United Nations, and because Saddam Hussein had resisted some 15 or 16, as I recall, UN resolutions, he had a broad coalition of support in the world. President Bush did. Now, what we're dealing with here is something that in many respects has gone back hundreds and hundreds of years. This is not totally new. I was President Ronald Reagan's Middle East envoy after the attacks on the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. I was there after the attack on the Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon. And so the idea that there's something new about terrorism, I think, is a mistake.
But with respect, dropping the most infernal equipment that you could possibly drop on a city like Baghdad and blowing it to pieces, that was new. That was not something which had happened traditionally. This was a country in which there was a very tender latticework of Sunni and Shia relationships, and those were blown to pieces. And lots of Saddam's old army is now inside ISIS fighting us.
The repression works, and the Saddam Hussein regime was a brutal one. They used chemical weapons on their neighbors. They used chemical weapons on the Kurds, their own people. And that nation, the Sunnis, the Shia, and the Kurds, were held together by force, by brutality, by imprisoning hundreds of thousands of people. And there's no question but that when a brutal repressive regime is replaced, that free people are free to do things in a different way. They're free to make good decisions, and they're also free to make bad decisions. And I would say that the Iraqi government made a bad mistake in favoring the Shia over the Sunnis and the Kurds, and not fashioning a government that was respectful of all the elements within that country.
A bad decision made by Iraq, but no bad decisions made by Donald Rumsfeld?
I must say, yeah, you clearly are on a tear here. I don't think there's been a public servant who hasn't made mistakes and wishes things might have turned out differently. And I didn't say what you're saying.
Let me ask you then about how you feel all of this has perhaps affected current American politics. Because, of course, you have Donald Trump saying, I want to make America great again, as if people feel in some way weakened by it all. And I'm wondering what you feel. I mean, do you, for example, support Donald Trump when he says he wants to make a strong America again?
Well, I don't support any of the candidates at the present time. I must say I think that there are a lot of Americans who feel that this current administration has stepped back and not contributed the kind of assistance in the world that might be more appropriate for the United States and more in line with the history of our country. But he's concerned about the fact that many of the candidates on both sides of the aisle are talking about the importance of the middle class and the fact that they seem to have been losing out, and concerned about the role of the United States and the concept of leading from behind, which is not leading at all.
Okay, well, a final question, Mr. Rumsfeld. A final question.
Sure.
Shutting Muslims out, closing the borders, as Mr. Trump suggested. Would you be sympathetic to that idea?
No, I think that our country was founded, as you well know, on a system of immigration, legal immigration, which has benefited our country greatly. Most of the people here have roots that came back from Western Europe and other parts of the world, and that's one of the great strengths of our country. I think what the candidates are debating and trying to figure out, and certainly on both sides of the aisle, including the administration, they're trying to figure out how we ought to manage the risks that real and that Europe faces as well, of having people come into the country illegally and not knowing who they are or why they're here, and running the risk that some of them might conceivably not wish our country well.
Donald
so
Rumsfeld.
I think that's the debate that's taking place.
Donald Rumsfeld, thank you very much indeed for talking with us. We'll go play solitaire.